Damon Rykor's frantic 911 call was supposed to save him, but instead it exposed the brutal truth about what really happened to his fiancée, Selene Harrow. A truth that Detective Marla Kade, Coroner Jessa Lorne, and promoter Evan Drayce would help unravel piece by piece, revealing how a celebrated fighter's double life ended in murder. On the night of Selene Harrow's death, everything began with a single phone call that should have been a lifeline, but instead became the first piece of evidence in a case that would shake a community and destroy the career of a rising star. Damon Rykor dialed 911 at exactly 10, his voice trembling as he reported that his fiancée was lying on the floor of their living room, unresponsive. The dispatcher, trained to remain calm in moments of chaos, asked him to explain what had happened, and Damon stammered through an account that seemed simple enough. He claimed Selene had slipped while rushing down the stairs, struck her head, and collapsed. To anyone listening in real time, it sounded like a tragic accident. Yet beneath the surface of that call, in the strained cadence of Damon's voice and the faint background noises recorded by the operator, something sinister lurked. The paramedics who responded were struck by the scene before them. Selene was sprawled on the floor, her long hair matted with blood from a gash near her temple. Damon, a towering figure known for his strength in the cage, hovered close by, wringing his hands as though he had no idea what to do with them. His face was pale, and sweat glistened on his forehead. Though the air in the house was cool, he repeated over and over that he had tried to save her, that she had been breathing when he first found her. But the paramedics, moving with grim efficiency, could only pronounce her dead. The initial report listed trauma to the head as the cause, possibly the result of a fall, but the detectives who soon arrived were not convinced. They noticed small inconsistencies. The blood pattern on the carpet did not match Damon's description of where she had landed, and the wound itself seemed deeper than what one would expect from a simple slip. Even the neighbors, who peeked nervously from their windows as the flashing lights filled the street, whispered about the strange noises they had heard earlier that evening. The word accident did not sit easily with anyone who looked closely. At the heart of it all was that the recording captured more than Damon intended. While his frantic voice filled most of the tape, there were moments where other sounds crept in, brief, distorted, but chilling in their implication. A muffled thud echoed just before Damon spoke to the operator, as though something heavy had struck the ground. Investigators who replayed the tape noticed what sounded like a faint groan in the background, quickly cut short, followed by Damon's panicked breathing. It was subtle enough to escape notice at first, but unmistakable once it was isolated. As the call circulated within the department, it became clear this would not be treated as a simple accident. Detective Marla Kade, experienced in cases where appearances concealed darker truths, immediately focused on Damon himself. His reputation as an MMA fighter carried weight, both in his favor and against him. To his fans he was disciplined, powerful, and honorable. To those who knew him more closely, he was a man who thrived on aggression, someone who had built his life around controlled violence. The possibility that this violence had spilled beyond the cage into his home became the unspoken question that hung over the investigation. Even Damon's behavior during the call seemed strange when studied in detail. He sounded panicked, but it was a controlled panic, almost as though he was aware that every word might be scrutinized later. He gave answers quickly, too quickly, as if and when he described Selene's injuries, his words were oddly clinical, not the desperate fumbling of a man losing the love of his life. Those who listened could not ignore the sense that he was constructing a narrative, even as he pleaded for help. For Damon, the call was meant to be proof of his innocence, a desperate attempt to show that he had done everything he could. But for the detectives who heard it, it was the first sign that the truth was far darker. What began as a tragedy was already starting to look like a crime, and the man who had once been celebrated as a fighter was now the prime suspect in a story that was only beginning to unfold. Damon Rykor's life looked perfect on the surface, but the deeper investigators went, the more contradictions they uncovered. To the public, He was a rising star in mixed martial arts, a man who had clawed his way out of poverty with nothing but discipline and raw talent. He was celebrated for his devastating knockouts, his calm stare before a fight, and his promise of one day holding a championship belt. But beneath the spotlight was another version of Damon, one that few people outside his inner circle dared to talk about. This second version was volatile, unpredictable, and capable of explosive rage that left those close to him walking on eggshells. Selene Harrow had lived in that world, and now detectives were determined to piece together what life with Damon had really been like. Detective Marla Kade started by canvassing the neighborhood, speaking to those who might have witnessed the days leading up to Selene's death. Neighbors described frequent arguments coming from the couple's home. One woman recalled loud crashes echoing through the walls, followed by long silence. Another mentioned seeing Selene outside on more than one occasion with puffy eyes, as though she had been crying. These weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, one that suggested their relationship had been stormy for far longer than Damon wanted to admit. Still, Damon had his defenders. His promoter, Evan Drayce, was quick to describe him as a dedicated athlete, someone whose life revolved around training camps, diet plans, and competition. Evan admitted Damon had a temper but brushed it off as part of the fighter's personality, something that came with the territory of high-level combat sports. To Evan, Damon's rough edges were the very thing that made him such a compelling fighter. Yet, as Detective Kade noted, those same traits that made him feared in the cage could make him dangerous outside of it. Investigators also pulled records from local gyms where Damon trained. Coaches described him as relentless, sometimes too relentless, taking sparring sessions beyond their intended limits. One younger fighter recounted how Damon once knocked him out in practice after a minor disagreement. The incident was brushed aside at the time, but in the shadow of Selene's death, it took on a far more troubling light. Damon was not merely aggressive. He seemed to thrive on domination. Selene's friends painted an even clearer picture of her private struggle. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed she had confided in a close friend about Damon's mood swings and her growing fear of him. She admitted she often hid bruises under her clothing and made excuses when people noticed. Though she never outright said she thought he might kill her, the implication was chilling. She described feeling trapped, unable to leave him without sparking an even greater eruption. The more investigators dug, the more obvious it became that Damon's double life was not just rumor, it was reality. Meanwhile, Damon himself was trying to control the narrative. He gave interviews in which he described Selene's death as a tragedy that shattered his world. He spoke about her kindness, her support during his toughest training camps, and how empty his life felt without her. To the cameras, he played the role of grieving fiancé convincingly, but behind the scenes, detectives noticed his demeanor shift whenever he thought no one was watching. His sorrow seemed to evaporate, replaced by impatience and irritation. For someone who had just lost the love of his life, his detachment was difficult to ignore. The public image of a disciplined athlete was eroding quickly. Each discovery chipped away at the myth Damon had built. The MMA fighter admired for his strength was now being re-examined as a man consumed by anger and control. Investigators began to theorize that Selene's death was not the result of a sudden outburst alone, but the final act in a relationship defined by escalating violence. The 911 call had opened the door to suspicion, but now the evidence of Damon's double life was giving shape to a motive. What had once been a tragic accident in the eyes of some was transforming into a story of power, fear, and control. Damon Rykor had mastered the art of presenting himself as a champion, but the mask was slipping. With every testimony and every revelation, the line between the fighter and the man behind closed doors grew sharper. For Detective Marla Kade, it was becoming impossible to separate Damon's professional brutality from his personal life. The question was no longer whether Damon had a temper, but whether that temper had finally consumed the woman who had trusted him most. The turning point in the investigation came when Selene Harrow's body was examined by Coroner Jessa Lorne. At first glance, some officers hoped the autopsy would confirm Damon Rykor's version of events, a fall down the stairs, an unfortunate accident. But Jessa's findings told a different story, one that was impossible to dismiss. Selene had not died from a single blow consistent with a stumble. Her body carried evidence of repeated blunt force trauma, and the placement of the injuries suggested deliberate violence. Selene's skull showed two distinct fractures, one at the temple and another toward the back of her head. If she had fallen forward or backward, only one fracture would make sense. The presence of both indicated separate impacts too forceful to be caused by a single fall. Even more telling were the injuries to her arms. Bruises and shallow cuts lined her forearms, the classic markers of defensive wounds. She had tried to protect herself against someone attacking her. These findings shattered Damon's story in an instant. The toxicology report added another layer to the truth. Damon had suggested to paramedics that Selene had been drinking before the incident, a detail that could have explained clumsiness or imbalance. Yet Jessa's report was clear: no alcohol, no drugs, nothing in her system that would have impaired her. This wasn't a case of a fiancé who had been careless. This was a woman who had been overpowered. Detectives returned to the 911 call, this time with Jessa's findings in mind. They replayed the tape over and over, listening for the details they had missed before. The faint thud recorded just seconds before Damon began speaking now carried a heavier weight. It was not the sound of someone slipping downstairs. It was the dull impact of a body hitting the ground. Just before that noise, Damon's voice could be heard faintly in the background, raised in anger. It was muffled but clear enough to show that he had been shouting at Selene moments before she fell silent. The discovery was chilling. Damon had not called 911 in the immediate aftermath of an accident. He had made the call after ensuring Selene was beyond help, carefully constructing a story to explain what had happened. The call, which he thought would protect him, had instead captured the evidence that exposed him. Detective Marla Kade confronted Damon with the findings, but he clung stubbornly to his story. He claimed the bruises on Selene's arms were old, the result of minor accident. He argued that the fractures on her head could still be explained by a fall if she had struck more than one surface on the way down. But Jessa Lorne's detailed report left little room for such theories. The injuries were fresh, forceful, and deliberate. Damon's explanation sounded more like rehearsed excuses than genuine shock. Behind the scenes, the case began to shift from a suspicious accident to a confirmed homicide. Prosecutors reviewing the evidence realized the 911 call paired with the autopsy results would be devastating in court. The timeline of events suggested Damon had lost his temper, attacked Selene, and then attempted to cover it with a staged call for help. Every detail pointed to intent, not accident. News of the autopsy findings leaked slowly to the public, and the perception of Damon began to change. Supporters who had defended him as a grieving fiancé started to withdraw. Media outlets that once praised his career began to highlight his violent tendencies and history of aggression. The narrative of the Golden Boy MMA fighter was collapsing, replaced by that of a man capable of brutality outside the ring. For Detective Marla Kade, the autopsy was the moment where suspicion hardened into certainty. Selene had not died by chance. She had fought for her life in those final moments, and her body told the story her voice never could. Damon Rykor's mask of innocence was unraveling, and the evidence was building toward a case that would show the world the fighter's darkest side. The deeper investigators dug into Damon Rykor's actions on the night of Selene Harrow's death. The more his carefully crafted version of events began to crumble. What had once sounded like the heartbreaking testimony of a man who had lost his fiancée was quickly revealed as a patchwork of half-truths and calculated misdirection. Detective Marla Kade and her team set out to trace Damon's movements, hour by hour, determined to uncover the cracks in his alibi, and what they found exposed a deliberate effort to hide the truth. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station became a key piece of the puzzle. Just 45 minutes before Damon dialed 911, cameras recorded him entering the store. He bought a bag of ice and rolls of sports tape. To the cashier, it may have seemed like a routine purchase for an athlete known for bruises and strains, but the timing was suspicious. When investigators confronted him about it, Damon insisted he was stocking up for a late-night training session. Yet his claim made little sense. He had called 911 less than an hour later, saying his fiancée had fallen and died suddenly. Why would he be thinking about training if Selene was already in danger or unwell? The ice and tape raised darker questions. Damon's hands bore injuries when paramedics arrived, scraped knuckles and fresh swelling. He explained them as the result of a tough sparring session earlier in the day, but the purchase of supplies suggested otherwise. Investigators began to suspect he had used the tape to conceal damage to his fists or planned to. The ice was likely intended to reduce the swelling before anyone noticed. Instead of rushing to save Selene, Damon had taken a detour to cover his tracks. Detectives then turned to Selene's phone, which revealed what Damon had most to lose. In the days leading up to her death, she had been drafting a message to a close friend. She never sent it, but the words were preserved in her drafts folder. In it she admitted she was preparing to leave Damon. She described feeling increasingly unsafe, saying she had begun looking for a place to stay temporarily. The message stopped mid-sentence, as though she had been interrupted, but the meaning was clear. Selene had been ready to break free from Damon's grip, and he likely knew. This discovery reframed everything. The motive was no longer just a sudden burst of anger. It was about control, about Damon's inability to accept that the woman he considered part of his image was slipping away. His career was on the rise, his name gaining traction in the fighting world, and Selene had been an important part of that story. The thought of her leaving, especially if she were to reveal his violent behavior, would not only humiliate him, but also tarnish the reputation he had built. For a man who thrived on dominance, the loss of control was intolerable. When detectives presented this evidence to Damon, his reaction confirmed their suspicions. Rather than breaking down in grief, he became defensive and combative, insisting Selene had no reason to leave him. He accused investigators of twisting her words, but his anger only made their case stronger. It was the same explosive temperament that friends and neighbors had described, now directed at those who challenged his story. The prosecution pieced together the sequence of events. Selene confronted Damon, or made clear she was planning to leave. He lashed out in violence, his fists causing the injuries documented by the coroner. Realizing what he had done, Damon attempted to stage the scene, making a calculated stop for ice and tape, before calling 911 in a performance of desperation. The enhanced recording of the call paired with Selene's unfinished message created a narrative that was both compelling and damning. By the time these details were ready to be shared with the court, Damon's reputation had already begun to collapse in the public eye. Headlines shifted from admiration of his athletic rise to speculation about his darker side. The once heroic figure was now portrayed as a man who could not separate the brutality of his profession from his personal life. His alibi, once thought convincing, had dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind a chilling portrait of calculated violence. The cracks in his story were no longer cracks at all but wide fissures, exposing a truth he could no longer conceal. The trial of Damon Rykor drew attention far beyond the borders of his hometown. News outlets across the country picked up the story, not just because it involved a professional fighter, but because of the chilling way the evidence unfolded. A man who once stepped into cages to prove his strength was now sitting in one of the most scrutinized courtrooms in the nation, his fate hanging on the testimony of experts, the recording of a single desperate call, and the haunting memory of Selene Harrow's final moment. Prosecutors built their case methodically, piece by piece. They began with the autopsy results, allowing Coroner Jessa Lorne to describe in detail the injuries Selene sustained. Her testimony painted a devastating picture of a woman who had not simply fallen, but had fought to defend herself against an attack. The jury was shown photographs of the defensive wounds on her arms and the fractures in her skull. Each image chipped away at the illusion of accident that Damon had clung to. Jessa's calm, clinical explanations carried more weight than any emotional appeal could. From there, prosecutors moved to the recording was played in its entirety for the courtroom, and the silence as it echoed through the chamber was suffocating. The jury listened to Damon's trembling voice, followed by the faint sounds in the background, his raised tone, the muffled thud, and the desperate groan that quickly faded. For the first time everyone could hear what investigators had pieced together. Selene had not been gone when Damon dialed, she had been fading,
and his call was not a cry for help but a cover for what he had done. Jurors shifted uneasily as the realization settled. Detective Marla Kade then laid out the timeline. She explained Damon's detour to the gas station, showing the footage of him buying ice and tape shortly before placing the emergency call. She highlighted his injuries, the swelling on his hands that could not be ignored, and she revealed Selene's unfinished message, the words of a woman preparing to leave her fiancé, preserved on her phone but never sent. The combination of evidence created a narrative that was impossible to dismiss. It wasn't simply about what happened the night Selene died. It was about the months of escalating violence that led to. The defense tried to counter with arguments about Damon's career, his stress, and his supposed devotion to Selene. They painted him as a man overwhelmed by tragedy, unfairly targeted because of his profession. But the jury had seen too much. They had heard too much. Damon's own demeanor in the courtroom didn't help him. When witnesses spoke of his temper, his jaw clenched visibly. When the 911 call was replayed, his eyes darted downward, his composure cracking. He looked less like a grieving fiancé, and more like a man cornered by his own lie. When the time came for the verdict, the tension was unbearable. Reporters filled the benches, Selene's family clutched each other's hands, and Damon sat motionless in his chair. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. The announcement landed like a heavy blow in the silent courtroom. For Selene's loved ones, it was a measure of justice, though it could never restore what was lost. For Damon it was the end of a career, and the collapse of the persona he had built for the world to admire. The sentencing sealed his fate, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had once thrived on locking opponents inside a cage and overpowering them with sheer force, was now confined to one himself, stripped of the cheers, the lights and the identity he had cherished. His name would no longer be remembered for victories in the ring, but for the brutality he carried into his own home. Selene Harrow's story lived on as a tragic reminder of how easily violence can hide behind charm, success, and public image. The 911 call that was supposed to prove Damon's innocence became the very thing that condemned him, a chilling piece of evidence that revealed the truth he thought he could bear. In the end, the fighter who once seemed unstoppable was defeated not by an opponent in the cage, but by his own darkness, exposed for the world to see.